Part 5. The Long March. 1. The Fifth Campaign. Here I could not even outline the absorbing and then only fragmentarily written history of the 6 years of the Soviets of South China, a period that was destined to be a prelude to the epic of the Long March. Mao Zedong had told briefly of the organic development of the Soviets and of the birth of the Red Army. He told how the communists built up from a few hundred ragged and half-starved but young and determined revolutionaries, an army of several tens of thousands of workers and peasants, until by 1930 they'd become such serious contenders for power that Nanjing had to hurl its first large-scale offensive against them. The initial annihilation drive, and then a second, a third, and a fourth, were net failures. In each of those campaigns, the Reds destroyed many brigades and whole divisions of Kuomintang troops, replenished their supplies of arms and ammunition, enlisted new warriors, and expanded their territory. Meanwhile, what sort of life went on beyond the impenetrable lines of the Red Irregulars? It seemed to me one of the amazing facts of our age that during the entire history of the Soviets in South China, not a single outside foreign observer had entered Red territory, the only communist-ruled nation in the world besides the USSR. Everything written about the Southern Soviets by foreigners was therefore secondary material, but a few salient points seemed now confirmable from accounts both friendly and inimical, and these clearly indicated the basis of the Red Army's support. Land was redistributed and taxes were lightened. Collective enterprise was established on a wide scale. By 1933, there were more than 1,000 Soviet cooperatives in Jiangxi alone. Unemployment, opium, prostitution, child slavery, and compulsory marriage were reported to be eliminated, and the living conditions of the workers and poor peasants in the peaceful areas greatly improved. Mass education made much progress in the stabilized Soviets. In some counties, the Reds attained a higher degree of literacy among the populace in 3 or 4 years than had been achieved anywhere else in rural China after centuries. In Xiankou, the communist model Xian, the populace was said to be nearly 80% literate. Revolution, observed Mao Zedong, is not a tea party. That Red terror methods were widely used against landlords and other class enemies who were arrested, deprived of land, condemned in mass trials and often executed, was undoubtedly true, as indeed the communists' own reports confirmed. Were such activities to be regarded as atrocities or as mass justice executed by the armed poor in punishment of white terror crimes by the rich when they had held the guns? Never having seen Soviet Jiangxi, I could add little with my testimony to an evaluation of second-hand materials about it, or to the usefulness of this book, which is largely limited to the range of an eyewitness. For that reason, I decided to omit from this volume some interview material concerning Soviet Jiangxi, which the reader would be entitled to regard as self-serving, in the absence of independent corroboration. Speculation on the Southern Soviets in any case was now a matter chiefly of academic interest. For late in October 1933, Nanjing mobilized for the fifth and greatest of its anti-Red wars, and 1 year later the Reds were finally forced to carry out a general retreat. Nearly everyone then supposed it was the end. The Red Army's funeral march. How badly mistaken they were was not to become manifest for almost 2 years, when a remarkable comeback, seldom equalled in history, was to reach a climax with events that put into the hands of the communists the life of the Generalissimo, who for a while really had believed his own boast, that he had exterminated the menace of communism. It was not until the 7th year of the fighting against the Reds that any notable success crowned the attempts to destroy them. The Reds then had actual administrative control over the great part of Jiangxi and large areas of Fujian and Hunan. There were other Soviet districts, not physically connected with Jiangxi territory, located in the provinces of Hunan, Hubei, Henan, Anhui, Sichuan, and Shanxi. Against the Reds, in the 5th campaign, Chiang Kai-shek mobilized about 900,000 troops, of whom perhaps 400,000, some 360 regiments, actively took part in the warfare in the Jiangxi-Fujian area, and against the Red Army in the Anhui, Henan, Hubei, Ouyuan area. But Jiangxi was the pivot of the whole campaign. Here the regular Red Army was able to mobilize a combined strength of 180,000 men, including all reserve divisions, and it had perhaps 200,000 partisans and Red Guards, but altogether it could muster a firing power of somewhat less than 100,000 rifles, no heavy artillery, and a very limited supply of grenades, shells, and ammunition, all of which were being made in the Red Arsenal in Zhejiang. Chiang adopted a new strategy to make the fullest use of his greatest assets: superior resources, technical equipment, access to supplies from the outside world, to which the Reds had no outlet, and some mechanized equipment, including an air force that had come to comprise nearly 400 navigable warplanes. The Reds had captured a few of Chiang's aeroplanes, and they had 3 or 4 pilots, but they lacked gasoline, bombs, and mechanics. Instead of an invasion of the Red districts and an attempt to take them by storm of superior force, which had in the past proved disastrous, Chiang now used the majority of his troops to surround the bandits and impose on them a strict economic blockade. And it was very costly. Chiang Kai-shek built hundreds of miles of military roads and thousands of small fortifications, which were made connectable by machine gun or artillery fire. His defensive-offensive strategy and tactics tended to diminish the Reds' superiority in maneuvering, and emphasize the disadvantages of their smaller numbers and lack of resources. Chiang wisely avoided exposing any large body of troops beyond the fringes of his network of roads and fortifications. They advanced only when well covered by artillery and aeroplanes, and rarely moved more than a few hundred yards ahead of the noose of forts, which stretched through the provinces of Jiangxi, Fujian, Hunan, Guangdong, and Guangxi. Deprived of opportunities to decoy, ambush, or outmaneuver their enemy in open battle, the Reds began to place their main reliance on positional warfare, and the error of this decision, and the reasons for it, will be alluded to further on. The 5th campaign was said to have been planned largely by Chiang Kai-shek's German advisors, notably General von Falkenhausen of the German army, who was then the Generalissimo's chief advisor. The new tactics were thorough, but they were also very slow and expensive. Operations dragged on for months, and still Nanjing had not struck a decisive blow at the main forces of its enemy. The effect of the blockade, however, was seriously felt in the Red districts, and especially the total absence of salt. The Little Red base was becoming inadequate to repel the combined military and economic pressure being applied against it. Considerable exploitation of the peasantry must have been necessary to maintain the astonishing year of resistance which was put up during this campaign. At the same time, it must be remembered that their fighters were peasants, owners of newly acquired land. For land alone, most peasants in China would fight to the death. The Jiangxi people knew that the return of the Kuomintang meant return to the landlords. Nanjing believed that its efforts at annihilation were about to succeed. The enemy was caged and could not escape. Thousands supposedly had been killed in the daily bombing and machine gunning from the air, as well as by purgations in districts reoccupied by the Kuomintang. The Red Army itself, according to Zhou Enlai, suffered over 60,000 casualties in this one siege. Whole areas were depopulated, sometimes by forced mass migrations, sometimes by the simpler expedient of mass executions. Kuomintang press releases estimated that about 1 million people were killed or starved to death in the process of recovering Soviet Jiangxi. Nevertheless, the 5th campaign proved inconclusive. It failed to destroy the living forces of the Red Army. A Red military conference was called in Zhejiang, and it was decided to withdraw, transferring the main Red strength to a new base. The retreat from Jiangxi evidently was so swiftly and secretly managed that the main forces of the Red troops, estimated at about 90,000 men, had already been marching for several days before the enemy headquarters became aware of what was taking place. They had mobilized in southern Jiangxi, withdrawing most of their regular troops from the northern front and replacing them with partisans. Those movements occurred always at night. When practically the whole Red Army was concentrated near Yudu in southern Jiangxi, the order was given for the Great March, which began on October 16th, 1934. For 3 nights the Reds pressed in 2 columns to the west and to the south. On the 4th they advanced, totally unexpectedly, almost simultaneously attacking the Hunan and Guangdong lines of fortifications. They took those by assault, put their astonished enemy on the run, and never stopped until they had occupied the ribbon of blockading forts and entrenchments on the southern front. This gave them roads to the south and to the west, along which their vanguard began its sensational trek. Besides the main strength of the army, thousands of Red peasants began this march, old and young, men, women, children, communists and non-communists. The arsenal was stripped, the factories were dismantled, machinery was loaded onto mules and donkeys. Everything that was portable and of value went with this strange cavalcade. As the march lengthened out, much of this burden had to be discarded, and the Reds told me that thousands of rifles and machine guns, much machinery, much ammunition, even much silver, lay buried on their long trail from the south. Someday in the future, they said, Red peasants, now surrounded by thousands of policing troops, would dig it up again. They awaited only the signal, and the war with Japan might prove to be that beacon. After the main forces of the Red Army evacuated Jiangxi, it was still many weeks before Nanjing troops succeeded in occupying the chief Red bases. Thousands of peasant Red Guards continued guerrilla fighting. To lead them, the Red Army left behind some of its ablest commanders: Shen Yi, Su Yu, Tan Qianlin, Xiang Ying, Fang Zhimin, Liu Xiao, Deng Zihui, Chu Qiupai, He Shuheng, and Changdingcheng. They had only 6,000 able-bodied regular troops, however, and 20,000 wounded, sheltered among the peasants. Many thousands of them were captured and executed, but they managed to fight a rearguard action which enabled the main forces to get well underway before Chiang Kai-shek could mobilize new forces to pursue and attempt to annihilate them on the march. Even in 1937, there were regions in Jiangxi, Fujian, and Guizhou held by these fragments of the Red Army, and that spring the government announced the beginning of another anti-Red campaign for a final cleanup in Fujian. 2. A nation emigrates. Having successfully broken through the first line of fortifications, the Red Army set out on its epochal year-long trek to the west and to the north, a varicolored and many-storied expedition, describable here only in the briefest outline. The communists told me that they were writing a collective account of the Long March, with contributions from dozens who made it, which already totaled about 300,000 words. Adventure, exploration, discovery, human courage and cowardice, ecstasy and triumph, suffering, sacrifice and loyalty, and then through it all, like a flame, an undimmed ardor and undying hope, an amazing revolutionary optimism of those thousands of youths who would not admit defeat by man or nature or God or death. All this and more seemed embodied in the history of an odyssey unequalled in modern times. The Reds themselves generally spoke of it as the 25,000 li march, and with all its twists, turns and counter-marches from the furthest point in Fujian to the end of the road in northwest Shanxi, some sections of the marches undoubtedly did that much, or more. An accurate stage-by-stage itinerary prepared by the 1st Army Corps showed that its route covered a total of 18,000 li, or 6,000 miles, about twice the width of the American continent, and this figure was perhaps the average march of the main forces. The journey took them across some of the world's most difficult trails, unfit for wheeled traffic, and across the high snow mountains of the greatest rivers of Asia. It was one long battle from beginning to end. 4 main lines of defense works, supported by strings of concrete machine gun nests and blockhouses, surrounded the Soviet districts in southwest China, and the Reds had to shatter those before they could reach the unblockaded areas to the west. The first line in Jiangxi was broken on October the 21st, 1934. The second in Hunan was occupied on November the 3rd, and a week later the third, also in Hunan, fell to the Reds after bloody fighting. The Guangxi and Hunan troops gave up the fourth and last line on November the 29th, and the Reds swung northward into Hunan to begin trekking in a straight line for Sichuan, where they planned to enter the Soviet districts and combine with the 4th Front Red Army there, under Xu Xiangqian. Between the dates mentioned above, 9 battles were fought. In all, a combination of 110 regiments had been mobilized in their path by Nanjing and by the provincial warlords of Chen Chitang, He Jian, and Pai Zongxi. During the march through Jiangxi, Guangdong, Guangxi, and Hunan, the Reds suffered very heavy losses. Their numbers were reduced by about 1/3 by the time they reached the border of Guizhou province. This was due first to the impediment of a vast amount of transport, 5,000 men being engaged in that task alone. The vanguard was very much slowed, and in many cases the enemy was given time to prepare elaborate obstructions in the line of march. Second, from Jiangxi, an undeviating northwesterly route was maintained, which enabled Nanjing to anticipate most of the Red Army's movements. Serious losses as a result of these errors caused the Reds to adopt new tactics in Guizhou. Instead of an arrow-like advance, they began a series of distracting maneuvers so that it became more and more difficult for Nanjing planes to identify the day-by-day objective of the main forces. 2 columns, and sometimes as many as 4 columns, engaged in a baffling series of maneuvers on the flanks of the central column, and the vanguard deployed a pincer-like front. Only the barest and lightest essentials of equipment were retained, and night marches for the greatly reduced Transport Corps, a daily target for the air bombing, became routine. Anticipating an attempt to cross the Yangtze River into Sichuan, Chiang Kai-shek withdrew thousands of troops from Hubei, Anhui, and Jiangxi and shipped them hurriedly westward to cut off, from the north, the Red Army's route of advance. All crossings were heavily fortified, all ferries were drawn to the north bank of the river, all roads were blocked, great areas were denuded of grain. Other thousands of Nanjing troops poured into Guizhou to reinforce the opium-soaked provincials of warlord Wang Jialie, whose army in the end was practically immobilized by the Reds. Still others were dispatched to the Yunnan border to set up obstacles there. In Guizhou, therefore, the Reds found a reception committee of a couple of 100,000 troops, and obstructions thrown up everywhere in their path. This necessitated 2 great countermarches across the province, and a wide circular movement around the capital. Maneuvers in Guizhou occupied the Reds for 4 months. during which they destroyed 5 enemy divisions, captured the headquarters of Governor Wang, and occupied his foreign-style palace in Xunyi, recruited about 20,000 men, and visited most of the villages and towns of the province, calling mass meetings and organizing communist cadres among the youth. Their losses were negligible, but they still faced the problem of crossing the Yangtze. By his swift concentration on the Guizhou-Sichuan border, Chiang Kai-shek had skillfully blocked the short, direct roads that led to the Great River. He now placed his main hope of exterminating the Reds on the prevention of this crossing at any point, hoping to push them far to the southwest or into the wastelands of Tibet. To his various commanders and the provincial warlords he telegraphed, "The fate of the nation and the party depends on bottling up the Reds south of the Yangtze." Suddenly, early in May 1935, the Reds turned southwards and entered Yunnan, where China's frontier meets Burma and Indochina. A spectacular march in 4 days brought them within 10 miles of the capital, Yunnan-Fu, and warlord Long Yun, Dragon Cloud, frantically mobilized all available troops for defense. Chiang's reinforcements, meanwhile, moved in from Guizhou in hot pursuit. Chiang himself and Madame Chiang, who'd been staying in Yunnan-Fu, hastily rushed down the French railway toward Indochina. A big squadron of Nanjing bombers kept up their daily egg-laying over the Reds, but on they came. Presently the panic ended. It was discovered that their drive on Yunnan-Fu had only been a diversion carried out by a few troops. The main Red forces were moving westward, obviously with the intention of crossing the river at Langai, one of the few navigable points of the upper Yangtze. Through the wild mountainous country of Yunnan, the Yangtze River flows deeply and swiftly between immense gorges, great peaks in places rising in defiles of a mile or more, with steep walls of rock lifting almost perpendicularly on either side. The few crossings had all been occupied long ago by government troops. Chiang was well pleased. He now ordered all boats drawn to the north bank of the river and burned. Then he started his own troops, and Long Yun's, in an enveloping movement around the Red Army, hoping to finish it off forever on the banks of this historic and treacherous stream. Seemingly unaware of their fate, the Reds continued to march rapidly westward in 3 columns towards Langai. The boats had been burned there, and Nanjing pilots reported that a Red vanguard had begun building a bamboo bridge. Chiang had become more confident. This bridge building would take weeks. But one evening, quite unobtrusively, a Red battalion suddenly reversed its direction. On a phenomenal forced march, it covered 85 miles in 1 night and a day, and in late afternoon descended upon the only other possible ferry crossing in the vicinity, at Zhouping Fort. Dressed in captured Nanjing uniforms, the battalion entered the town at dusk without arousing comment, and quietly disarmed the garrison. Boats had been withdrawn to the north bank, but they had not been destroyed. Why spoil boats when the Reds were hundreds of li distant, and not coming there anyway, so the government troops may have reasoned. But how to get one over to the south bank? After dark, the Reds escorted a village official to the river and forced him to call out to the guards on the opposite side that some government troops had arrived and wanted a boat. Unsuspectingly, one was sent across. Into it piled a detachment of these quote-unquote Nanjing soldiers, who then disembarked on the north shore, in Sichuan, at last. Calmly entering the garrison, they surprised guards who were peacefully playing mahjong, and whose stacked weapons the Reds took over without any struggle. Meanwhile, the main forces of the Red Army had executed a wide countermarch, and by noon the next day the vanguard reached the fort. Crossing was now a simple matter. 6 big boats worked constantly for 9 days. The entire army was transported into Sichuan without a life lost. Having concluded the operation, the Reds promptly destroyed the vessels and lay down to sleep. When Chiang's forces reached the river 2 days later, the rear guard of their enemy called cheerily to them from the north bank to come on over. The swimming was fine. The government troops were obliged to make a detour of over 200 li to the nearest crossing, and the Reds thus shook them from their trail. Infuriated, the Generalissimo now flew to Sichuan, where he mobilized new forces in the path of the oncoming horde, hoping to cut them off at one more strategic river, the Great Dadu. 3. The Heroes of Dadu. The crossing of the Dadu River was the most critical single incident of the Long March. Had the Red Army failed there, quite possibly it would have been exterminated. The historic precedent for such a fate already existed. On the banks of the remote Dadu, the heroes of the 3 kingdoms and many warriors since then had met defeat, and in these same gorges the last of the Taiping rebels, an army of 100,000 led by Prince Shi Da Kai, was in the 19th century surrounded and completely destroyed by the Manchu forces under the famous Zheng Guofan. To warlords Liu Xiang and Liu Wenhui, his allies in Sichuan, and to his own generals in command of the government pursuit, Generalissimo Chiang now wired an exhortation to repeat the history of the Taiping. But the Reds also knew about Shi Dakai, and that the main cause of his defeat had been a costly delay. Arriving at the banks of the Dadu, Prince Shi had paused for 3 days to honor the birth of his son, an imperial prince. Those days of rest had given his enemy the chance to concentrate against him, and to make the swift marches in his rear that blocked his line of retreat. Realizing his mistake made too late, Prince Shi had tried to break the enemy encirclement, but it was impossible to maneuver in the narrow terrain of the defiles, and he was erased from the map. The Reds determined not to repeat his error, moving rapidly northward from the Gold Sand River, as the Yangtze there is known, into Sichuan. They soon entered the tribal country of warlike aborigines, the white and black Lolos of independent Lololand. Never conquered, never absorbed by the Chinese who dwelt all around them, the turbulent Lolos had for centuries occupied that densely forested and mountainous spur of Sichuan, whose borders are marked by the great southward arc described by the Yangtze just east of Tibet. Chiang Kai-shek could well have confidently counted on a long delay and a weakening of the Reds here, which would enable him to concentrate north of the Dadu. The Lolos' hatred of the Chinese was traditional, and rarely had any Chinese army crossed their borders without heavy losses or extermination. But the Reds had already safely passed through the tribal districts of the Miao and the Shan peoples, aborigines of Guizhou and Yunnan, and had won their friendship and even enlisted some tribesmen in their army. Now they sent envoys ahead to parley with the Lolos. On the way they captured several towns on the borders of independent Lololand, where they found a number of Lolo chieftains who'd been imprisoned as hostages by provincial Chinese warlords. Freed and sent back to their people, these men naturally praised the Reds. In the vanguard of the Red Army was Commander Liu Bocheng, who had once been an officer in a warlord army of Sichuan. Liu knew the tribal people and their inner feuds and discontent. Especially he knew their hatred of Chinese, and he could speak something of the Lolo tongue. Assigned the task of negotiating a friendly alliance, he entered their territory and went into conference with the chieftains. The Lolos, he said, opposed warlords like Liu Xiang and Liu Wenhui and the Guomindang. So did the Reds. The Lolos wanted to preserve their independence. Red policies favored autonomy for all the national minorities of China. The Lolos hated the Chinese because they had been oppressed by them. But there were white Chinese and red Chinese, just as there were white Lolos and black Lolos. And it was the white Chinese who had always slain and oppressed the Lolos. Should not the red Chinese and the black Lolos unite against their common enemies, the white Chinese? The Lolos listened interestedly. Slyly they asked for arms and bullets to guard their independence and help red Chinese fight the whites. To their astonishment, the Reds gave them both. And so it happened that not only a speedy but a politically useful passage was accomplished. Hundreds of Lolos enlisted with the red Chinese to march to the Dadu River and to fight the common enemy. Some of these Lolos were to trek clear to the northwest. Liu Bocheng drank the blood of a newly killed chicken before the high chieftain of the Lolos, who drank also, and they swore blood brotherhood in the tribal manner. By this vow the Reds declared that whosoever should violate the terms of their alliance would be even as weak and cowardly as the fowl. Thus a vanguard division of the 1st Army Corps, led by Lin Biao, reached the Dadu He. On the last day of the march, they emerged from the forests of Lololand, in the thick foliage of which Nanjing pilots had completely lost track of them, to descend suddenly on the river town of Anjianchang, just as unheralded as they had come into Zhoubing Fort. Guided over narrow mountain trails by the Lolos, the vanguard crept quietly up to the little town, and from the heights looked down on the riverbank and saw with amazement and delight one of the 3 ferry boats made fast on the south of the river. Once more an act of fate had befriended them. How had it happened? On the opposite shore there was only 1 regiment of the troops of General Liu Wenhui, the co-dictator of Sichuan province. Other Sichuan troops, as well as reinforcements from Nanjing, were leisurely proceeding towards the Dadu, but the single regiment meanwhile must have seemed enough. A squad should have been ample, with all boats moored to the north. But the commander of that regiment was a native of the district. He knew the country the Reds must pass through, and how long it would take them to penetrate to the river. They would be many days yet, he could have told his men. And his wife, one learned, had been a native of Anjianchang, so he must cross to the south bank to visit his relatives and his friends and to feast with them. Thus it happened that the Reds, taking the town by surprise, captured the commander, his boat, and their passage to the north. 16 men from each of 5 companies volunteered to cross in the first boat and bring back the others, while on the south bank the Reds set up machine guns on the mountainsides and over the river spread a screen of protected fire concentrated on the enemy's exposed positions. It was May. Floods poured down the mountains, and the river was swift and even wider than the Yangtze. Starting far upstream, the ferry took 2 hours to cross and land just opposite the town. From the south bank, the villagers of Anjianchang watched breathlessly. They would be wiped out. But wait, they saw the voyagers land almost beneath the guns of the enemy. Now surely they would be finished. And yet, from the south bank, the red machine guns barked on. The onlookers saw the little party climb ashore, hurriedly take cover, then slowly work their way up a steep cliff overhanging the enemy's positions. There they set up their own light machine guns and sent a downpour of lead and hand grenades into the enemy redoubts along the river. Suddenly the white troops ceased firing, broke from their redoubts and fled to a second, and then a third line of defense. A great murmur went up from the south bank, and shouts of "How!" drifted across the river to the little band who had captured the ferry landing. Meanwhile the first boat returned, towing 2 others, and on the second trip each carried 80 men. The enemy had fled. That day and night, and the next, those 3 ferries of Anjianchang worked back and forth until at least nearly a division had been transferred to the northern bank. But the river flowed faster and faster. The crossing became more and more difficult. On the 3rd day it took 4 hours to shift a boatload of men from shore to shore. At this rate it would be weeks before the whole army and its animals and supplies could be moved. Long before the operation was completed they would be encircled. The 1st Army Corps had now crowded into Anjianchang, and behind them were the flanking columns and the transport and rear guard. Chiang Kai-shek's aeroplanes had found the spot and heavily bombed. Enemy troops were racing up from the southeast, others approaching from the north. A hurried military conference was summoned by Lin Biao. Zhu De, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and Peng Dehuai had by now reached the river. They took a decision and began to carry it out at once. Some 400 li to the west of Anjianchang, where the gorges rise very high and the river flows narrow, deep, and swift, there was an iron chain suspension bridge called the Liuding Qiao, the bridge fixed by Liu. It was the last possible crossing of the Dadu east of Tibet. Towards this, the barefoot Reds now set out along a trail that wound through the gorges, at times climbing several thousand feet, again dropping low to the level of the swollen stream itself and wallowing through waist-deep mud. If they captured the Liuding Qiao, the whole army could enter central Sichuan. If they failed, they would have to retrace their steps through Lolo-land, re-enter Yunnan, and fight their way westward toward Lijiang on the Tibetan border, a detour of more than 1,000 li, which few might hope to survive. As their main forces pushed westward along the southern bank, the Red Division already on the northern bank moved also. Sometimes the gorges between them closed so narrowly that the 2 lines of Reds could shout to each other across the stream. Sometimes the gulf between them measured their fear that the Dadu might separate them forever, and they stepped more swiftly. As they wound in long dragon files along the cliffs at night, their 10,000 torches sent arrows of light slanting down the dark face of the imprisoning river. Day and night these vanguards moved at double quick, pausing only for brief 10-minute rests and meals, when the soldiers listened to lectures by their weary political workers, who over and over again explained the importance of this one action, exhorting each to give his last breath, his last urgent strength, for victory in the test ahead of them. There could be no slackening of pace, no half-heartedness, no fatigue. Victory was life, said Peng Dehuai. Defeat was certain death. On the 2nd day, the vanguard on the right bank fell behind. Sichuan troops had set up positions on the road, and skirmishes took place. Those on the southern bank pressed on more grimly. Presently new troops appeared on the opposite bank, and through their field glasses the Reds saw that they were white reinforcements, hurrying to the bridge fixed by Liu. For a whole day these troops raced each other along the stream, but gradually the Red vanguard, the pick of all the Red Army, pulled away from the enemy's tired soldiers, whose rests were longer and more frequent, whose energy seemed more spent, and who were perhaps none too anxious to die for a bridge. The bridge fixed by Liu was built centuries ago, and in the manner of all bridges of the deep rivers of western China. 16 heavy iron chains, with a span of some 100 yards or more, were stretched across the river, their ends embedded on each side under great piles of cemented rock, beneath the stone bridgeheads. Thick boards lashed over the chains made the road of the bridge, but upon their arrival the Reds found that half this wooden flooring had been removed, and before them only the bare iron chains swung to a point midway in the stream. At the northern bridgehead an enemy machine gun nest faced them, and behind it were positions held by a regiment of white troops. The bridge should, of course, have been destroyed, but the Sichuanese were sentimental about their few bridges. It was not easy to rebuild them, and they were costly. Of Liuding Bridge it was said that the wealth of the 18 provinces contribute to build it. And who would have thought the Reds would insanely try to cross on the chains alone? But that was what they did. No time was to be lost. The bridge must be captured before enemy reinforcements arrived. Once more, volunteers were called for. One by one, Red soldiers stepped forwards to risk their lives, and, of those who offered themselves, 30 were chosen. Hand grenades and Mausers were strapped to their backs, and soon they were swinging out above the boiling river, moving hand over hand, clinging to the iron chains. Red machine guns barked at enemy redoubts and spattered the bridgehead with bullets. The enemies replied with machine gunning of his own, and snipers shot at the Reds tossing high above the water, working slowly toward them. The first warrior was hit and dropped into the current below. A second fell, and then a third. But as others drew nearer the center, the bridge flooring somewhat protected those dare-to-dies, and most of the enemy bullets glanced off or ended in the cliffs on the opposite bank. Probably never before had the Sichuanese seen fighters like these, men for whom soldiering was not just a rice bowl, and youths ready to commit suicide to win. Were they human beings, or madmen, or gods? Was their own morale affected? Did they perhaps not shoot to kill? Did some of them secretly pray that these men would succeed in their attempt? At last, one Red crawled up over the bridge flooring, uncapped a grenade, and tossed it with perfect aim into the enemy redoubt. Nationalist officers ordered the rest of the planking torn up. It was already too late. More Reds were crawling into sight. Paraffin was thrown onto the planking, and it began to burn. By then, about 20 Reds were moving forward on their hands and knees, tossing grenade after grenade into the enemy machine gun nest. Suddenly, on the southern shore, their comrades began to shout with joy, "Long live the Red Army! Long live the Revolution! Long live the heroes of Dadu He!" For the enemy was withdrawing in pell-mell flight, running full speed over the remaining planks of the bridge. Through the flames licking toward them, the assailants nimbly hopped into the enemy's redoubt and turned the abandoned machine gun against the shore. More Reds now swarmed over the chains and arrived to help put out the fire and replace the boards. And soon afterwards the Red division that had crossed at Andianchang came into sight, opening a flank attack on the remaining enemy positions, so that in a little while the white troops were wholly in flight, either in flight, that is, or with the Reds, for about 100 Sichuan soldiers here threw down their rifles and turned to join their pursuers. In an hour or two the whole army was joyously tramping and singing its way across the river Dadu into Sichuan. Far overhead, angrily and impotently roared the planes of Chiang Kai-shek, and the Reds cried out in delirious challenge to them. For their distinguished bravery, the heroes of Andianchang and Liu Dingchao were awarded the Gold Star, the highest decoration in the Red Army of China. 4. Across the Great Grasslands. Safely across the Dadu, the Reds struck off into the comparative freedom of western Sichuan, where the blockhouse system had not been completed, and where the initiative rested largely in their own hands. But hardships between battles were not over. Another 2,000 miles of marching, studded by 7 great mountain ranges, still lay ahead of them. North of the Dadu River, the Reds climbed 16,000 feet over the Great Snowy Mountain, and, in the rarefied air of its crest, looked to the west and saw a sea of snow peaks. Tibet. It was already June, and in the lowlands very warm, but as they crossed the Daxueshan, many of those poorly clad, thin-blooded southerners, unused to high altitudes, perished from exposure. Harder yet to ascend was the desolate Baodonggang mountain, up which they literally built their own road, felling long bamboos and laying them down for a track through a tortuous treacle of waist-deep mud. On this peak, Mao Zedong told me, one army corps lost 2/3 of its transport animals. Hundreds fell down and never got up. They climbed on the Enlai range next, and more lost men and animals. Then they straddled the lovely Dream Pen mountain, and after it the Big Drum, and these also took their toll of life. Finally, on July the 20th of 1935, they entered the rich Maogong area in northwest Sichuan, and connected with the 4th Front Army and the Soviet regions of the Songban. Here they paused for a long rest, took assessment of their losses, and reformed their ranks. The 1st, 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 9th Army Corps, which had begun the journey in Jiangxi 9 months earlier with about 90,000 armed men, could now muster beneath their hammer and sickle banners about 45,000. Not all had been lost, stayed, or captured. Behind the line of march in Hunan, Guizhou, and Yunnan, the Red Army had, as part of its tactics of defense, left small cadres of regular troops to organize partisan groups among the peasantry and create disturbances and diversionist activity on the enemy's flanks. Hundreds of captured rifles had been distributed along the route, and stretching clear from Jiangxi to Sichuan were new zones of trouble for the Kuomintang forces. He Lang still held his little Soviet area in northern Hunan. and had been joined there by the army of Xiao Ge. The numerous newly created partisan detachments began working slowly toward that region. Nanjing was not to dislodge Helang for a whole year, and then only after he had been ordered by the Red Army headquarters to move into Sichuan, an operation which he would complete via Tibet against amazing obstacles. The journey of the Jiangxi Reds thus far had provided them with much food for reflection. They had won many new friends and made many bitter enemies. Along their route they had provisioned themselves by confiscating the supplies of the rich, the landlords, officials, bureaucrats, and big gentry. Finance Commissioner Lin Xuhan told me that such sieges were systematically carried out according to Soviet laws, and that only the confiscation department of the Finance Commission was empowered to distribute the goods that were taken. It husbanded the army's resources, was informed by radio of all confiscations made, and assigned quantities of provisions for each section of the marchers, who often made a solid serpentine of 50 miles or more curling over the hills. There were big surpluses, more than the Reds could carry, and these were distributed among the local poor. In Yunnan, the Reds seized thousands of hams from rich packers there, and peasants came from miles around to receive their free portions. A new incident in the history of the ham industry, said Mao Zedong. Tons of salt were likewise distributed. In Guizhou, many duck farms were seized from the landlords and officials, and the Reds ate duck until, in the words of Wu Liangbing, they were simply disgusted with duck. From Jiangxi they had carried Nanjing notes and silver dollars and bullion from their state bank, and in poor districts in their path they used this money to pay for their needs. Land deeds were destroyed, taxes abolished, and the poor peasantry armed. Except for their experiences in western Sichuan, the Reds told me they were welcomed everywhere by the masses of the peasantry. Their Robin Hood policies were noised ahead of them, and often the oppressed peasantry sent groups to urge them to detour and liberate their districts. They had little conception of the Red Army's political program, of course. They only knew that it was a poor man's army, said Wu Liangbing. That was enough. Mao Zedong told me laughingly of one such delegation which arrived to welcome Su Wei-ai Xiansheng, Mr. Soviet. These rustics were no more ignorant, however, than the Fujian militarist Lu Xingbang, who once posted a notice throughout his fiefdom ordering a reward for the capture, dead or alive, of Su Wei-ai. Lu announced that this fellow had been doing a lot of damage everywhere and must be exterminated. In Mao'er-kai and Mougong, the southern armies rested for 3 weeks, while the Revolutionary Military Council and representatives of the party and the Soviet government discussed plans for the future. It may be recalled that the Fourth Front Red Army, which had made its base in Sichuan as early as 1933, had originally been formed in the Henan, Hubei, and Anhui Soviet districts. Its march across Henan to Sichuan had been led by Xu Xiangjian and Zhang Guotao, 2 veteran Reds, of whom something more is said later on. Remarkable successes and tragic excesses had marked their campaigns in Sichuan, the whole northern half of which had once been under their sway. At the time of its junction in Mougong with the southern Bolsheviks, Xu Xiangjian's army numbered around 50,000 men, so that the combined Red force concentrated in western Sichuan in July 1935 was nearly 100,000. Here the two armies divided, part of the southerners continuing northward, while the rest remained with the Fourth Front Army in Sichuan. There was disagreement about the correct course to pursue. Zhang Guotao and Xu Xiangjian favored remaining in Sichuan and attempting to reassert communist influence south of the Yangtze. Mao Zedong, Zhu De, and the majority of the Politburo were determined to continue into the northwest. The period of indecision was ended by 2 factors. First was an enveloping movement by Chiang Kai-shek's troops, moving into Sichuan from the east and from the north, which succeeded in driving a wedge between 2 sections of the Red Army. Second was the rapid rise of one of the hurried rivers of Sichuan, which then physically divided the forces and which suddenly became impassable. There were other factors of intra-party struggle involved, which need not be discussed here. In August, with the 1st Army Corps as vanguard, the main forces from Jiangxi continued the northward march, leaving Zhu De and Li Xiannian with Xu Xiangjian and Zhang Guotao. The Fourth Front Army was to remain here and in Tibet for another year, and be joined by Helong's Second Front Army, before making a sensational march into Gansu. Leading the Red Cavalcade that in August 1935 moved toward the Great Grasslands, on the border of Sichuan and Tibet, were commanders Lin Biao, Peng Dehuai, Zuo Chuan, Chen Geng, Zhou Enlai, and Mao Zedong. Most of the officials from the Jiangxi central government, and a majority of the members of the Central Committee of the party. They began this last phase of the march with about 30,000 men. The most dangerous and exciting travel lay before them, for the route they chose led through wild country inhabited by the independent Manzhu tribesmen and the nomadic Xifan, a warring people of eastern Tibet. Passing into the Manzhu and Tibetan territories, the Reds for the first time faced a populace united in its hostility to them, and their sufferings on this part of the trek exceeded anything of the past. They had money but could buy no food. They had guns but their enemies were invisible. As they marched into the thick forests and jungles and across the headwaters of a dozen great rivers, the tribesmen withdrew from the vicinity of the march. They stripped their houses bare, carried off all edibles, drove their cattle and fowl to the plateaus, and simply disinhabited the whole area. A few hundred yards on either side of the road, however, it was quite unsafe. Many a Red who ventured to forage for a sheep never returned. The mountaineers hid in the thick bush and sniped at the marching invaders. They climbed the mountains, and when the Reds filed through the deep, narrow rock passes where sometimes only one or two could move abreast, the Manzhu rolled huge boulders down to crush them and their animals. Here were no chances to explain Red policy towards national minorities, no opportunities for friendly alliance. The Manzhu Queen had an implacable traditional hatred for Chinese of any variety, and recognized no distinctions between red and white. She threatened to boil alive anyone who helped the travelers. Unable to get food except by capturing it, the Reds were obliged to make war for a few cattle. Mao told me that they had a saying then, to buy one sheep costs the life of one man. From the Manzhu fields they harvested green Tibetan wheat, and vegetables such as beets and turnips, the latter of an enormous size that would feed 15 men, according to Mao Zedong. On such meagre supplies, they equipped themselves to cross the great grasslands. "This is our only foreign debt," Mao said to me humorously, "and some day we must pay the Manzhu and the Tibetans for the provisions we were obliged to take from them." Only by capturing tribesmen could they find guides through the country, but of these guides they made friends, and after the Manzhu frontier was crossed, many continued the journey. Some of them were now students in the Communist Party school in Shanxi, and might one day return to their land to tell the people the difference between red and white Chinese. In the grasslands there was no human habitation for 10 days, almost perpetual rainfalls over this swampland, and it was possible to cross its centre only by a maze of narrow footholds known to the native mountaineers who led the Reds. More animals were lost, and more men. Many foundered in the weird sea of wet grass and dropped from sight into the depths of the swamp, beyond reach of their comrades. There was no firewood. They were obliged to eat their wheat green and vegetables raw. There were no trees for shelter, and the lightly equipped Reds carried no tents. At night they huddled under bushes tied together, which gave but scant protection against the rain. But from this trial, too, they emerged triumphant, more so, at least, than the white troops who pursued them, lost their way, and turned back with only a fraction of their number intact. The Red Army now reached the Gansu border. Several battles still lay ahead, the loss of any one of which might have meant decisive defeat. More Nanjing, Dongbei, and Muslim troops had been mobilized in southern Gansu to stop their march, but they managed to break through all of these blockades, and in the process annexed hundreds of horses from the Muslim cavalry, which people had confidently predicted would finish them once and for all. Footsore, weary, and at the limit of human endurance, they finally entered northern Shanxi, just below the Great Wall. On October the 20th, 1935, a year after its departure from Jiangxi, the vanguard of the First Front Army connected with the 25th, 26th, and 27th Red Armies, which had already established a small base of Soviet power in Shanxi in 1933. Numbering fewer than 20,000 survivors now, they sat down to realize the significance of their achievement. The statistical recapitulation of the Long March is impressive. It shows that there was an average of almost a skirmish a day, somewhere on the line, while altogether 15 whole days were devoted to major pitched battles. Out of a total of 368 days en route, 235 were consumed in marches by day, and 18 in marches by night. Of the 100 days of halts, many of which were devoted to skirmishes, 56 days were spent in northwestern Sichuan, leaving only 44 days of rest over a distance of about 5,000 miles, or an average of one halt for every 114 miles of marching. The mean daily stage covered was 71 li, or nearly 24 miles, a phenomenal pace for a great army and its transport to average over some of the most hazardous terrain on Earth. According to data furnished to me by Commander Zhou Chuan, the Reds crossed 18 mountain ranges, 5 of which were perennially snow-capped, and they crossed 24 rivers. They passed through 12 different provinces, occupied 62 cities and towns, and broke through enveloping armies of 10 different provincial warlords, besides defeating, eluding, or outmaneuvering the various forces of central government troops sent against them. They crossed 6 different aboriginal districts and penetrated areas through which no Chinese army had gone for scores of years. However one might feel about the Reds and what they represented politically, and there was plenty of room for argument, it was impossible to deny recognition of their long march, the Changjung as they called it, one of the great exploits of military history. In Asia, only the Mongols had surpassed it, and in the past 3 centuries there had been no similar armed migration of a nation, with the exception perhaps of the amazing flight of the Torgut, of which Sven Hedin told in his Jiahol, City of Emperors. Hannibal's march over the Alps looked like a holiday excursion beside it. A more interesting comparison was Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, when the Grand Army was utterly broken and demoralized. While the Red Army's march to the northwest was unquestionably a strategic retreat, forced upon it by regionally decisive defeats, the army finally reached its objective with its nucleus still intact and its morale and political will evidently as strong as ever. The communists rationalized and apparently believed that they were advancing towards an anti-Japanese front, and this was a psychological factor of great importance. It helped them turn what might have been a demoralized retreat into a spirited march of victory. History has subsequently shown that they were right in emphasizing what was undoubtedly the second fundamental reason for their migration, an advance to a region which they correctly foresaw was to play a determining role in the immediate destinies of China, Japan, and Soviet Russia. This skillful propagandive maneuver must be noted as a piece of brilliant political strategy. It was to a large extent responsible for the successful conclusion of the heroic trek. In one sense, this mass migration was the biggest armed propaganda tour in history. The Reds passed through provinces populated by more than 200 million people. Between battles and skirmishes in every town occupied, they called mass meetings, gave theatrical performances, heavily taxed the rich, freed many slaves, some of whom joined the Red Army, preached liberty, equality, democracy, confiscated the property of the traitors, the officials, big landlords and tax collectors, and distributed their goods among the poor. Millions of the poor had now seen the Red Army and heard it speak, and were no longer afraid of it. The Reds explained the aims of agrarian revolution in their anti-Japanese policy. They armed thousands of peasants and left cadres behind to train Red partisans who kept Nanjing's troops busy. Many thousands dropped out on the long and heartbreaking march, but thousands of others, farmers, apprentices, slaves, deserters from the Kuomintang ranks, workers, all the disinherited, joined in and filled the ranks. Someday someone will write the full epic of this exciting expedition. Meanwhile, as epilogue, I offer a free translation of a classical poem about this 6,000-mile excursion, written by Chairman Mao Zedong, a rebel who could write verse as well as lead a crusade. The Red Army, never fearing the challenging long march, looked lightly on the many peaks and rivers. Wuliang's range rose, lowered, rippled, and green-tiered were the rounded steps of Wumong, warm beating the gold sand river's waves against the rocks, and cold the iron chain spans of Dudu's bridge. 1,000 joyous li of freshening snow on Minshan, and then, the last pass vanquished, 3 armies smiled.